Here's Jordan Peterson to give a goofy rebuttal to an argument from Matt Dillahunty.
Okay,
So
I don't want to take up too much time, but did you want to speak
I
to
have
that?
a quick comment on riding around on the shoulders of giants, which was the central theme in Matt's answer. We ride around on the shoulder of giants, and the meta-giant is God.
Riding around on the shoulders of giants just means that we take advantage of the most useful discoveries and innovations made by people in the past. The problem with thinking of God as a meta-giant is that sometimes we step off of the shoulders of some of those past giants. We stepped off of Aristotle's shoulders and onto Newton's. We stepped off of Newton's shoulders and then onto Einstein's. The idea that most theists have of God is that he is an infallible giant off of whose shoulders we ought never step. Peterson's conception of God is different. He doesn't believe that God is an actual person the way most theists do. Rather, Peterson believes God to be an abstraction, perhaps even a metaphor for what is, in the end, the best way of conceiving reality and acting within reality. When Peterson talks about God, he's not talking about the same timeless, spaceless, disembodied mind that many apologists and theologians have in mind. Unlike most theists' conception of God, Peterson's God is a metaphorical person, not a literal person. So it's silly to portray this as a rebuttal to an atheist, given that by most theists' conception of an atheist, Peterson is an atheist as well.
That's a very good way of thinking about it.
But in this society, they are no more criminally minded. Like, we have a religious foundation, right? Like, I wouldn't go around like raping and pillaging if I abandoned God, but there were societies that did when they didn't have that structure. So
I'm not convinced of that premise. I'm not convinced that such behavior was more common among atheist societies than theist societies. Certainly theist societies are not immune to such behavior. In fact, when you compare the most secular contemporary populations to the most religious populations, it looks as though the more secular populations have less violence than the more religious ones.
but how do you resolve that?
I'm not saying that religious authorities haven't been useful. It's just that what I hear from some people is that we should keep this because of that particular usefulness, because they fear what will happen otherwise, because what they've seen in the past. And I don't buy that, because that boils down to saying, I may not need religion, but you people do. And that is far too arrogant for me to ever adopt as a position.
But again, if you compare the prevalence of violence in the most religious populations to the violence in the least religious populations, it doesn't look as though religion is the most effective means of curtailing violence. If you look at even just the US, rates of violence today are still lower than rates of violence in the early 90s, despite Americans being measurably less religious today.
Okay,
So
I don't want to take up too much time,
quick,
but did you want to speak
I have
to
a
that?
quick comment on riding around on the shoulders of giants, which was the central theme in Matt's answer. We ride around on the shoulder of giants, and the meta-giant is God. That's a very good way of thinking about it.
Except that I can identify.
We can think about that as, I don't care about the metaphysical implications of that. I don't have to care about that at the moment.
Then you don't care about theism as most theists conceive of it.
But if you look at the evolution of the idea of God, for example, and I think this is particularly true with the evolution of the idea of Christ, is that we do ride around on the shoulders of giants.
Most theists don't believe that the most accurate conception of God evolves. And if you believe that the idea of God can evolve, and especially if you believe that the idea of God should evolve, then such an idea cannot serve as a fundamental basis of morality. A foundation which evolves is not a foundation at all.
And the figure of Christ, psychologically speaking, is the giant among giants. It's a meta-giant, and it's a ritual model for emulation. And the ritual model is something like, pick up your damn suffering and bear it nobly, which is a metaphysical statement in some sense that lies at the bottom of the ethic even that Matt is presenting.
I thought you weren't concerned with the metaphysics of this issue, Jordan. Also, I strongly suspect that Peterson likes to interpret the central idea behind Jesus and Christianity to be pick up your cross and bear it because he is a conservative. And as a conservative, he has a knee-jerk antipathy toward any attempt to improve upon society as a whole. He would prefer that, instead of trying to improve upon the system, people just grin and bear it and not complain about it.
Matt is presenting. And so it is deeply embedded in a religious substructure. And that's the metaphorical substructure that I was talking about that necessarily underlies these self-evident axiomatic rules. which are not by any means, as you point out, self-evident in the least. There's plenty of cultures that train their young men to be absolutely barbaric monsters, right? Warriors, rapists, right? Bloodthirsty right to the core. Perfectly viable mode of being.
I'm skeptical that such a mode of being is, in fact, in the long term viable, let alone perfectly viable.
Arguably speaking, from the perspective of generating a set of axiomatic rules. Why is it not better to have 10,000 women than one?
If everything is consensual, I don't see how any number of women is inherently better or worse than any other. If we're talking about a scenario which isn't consensual, then that kind of behavior is only going to be tolerated for so long and by a limited number of people. Even in the most patriarchal societies nowadays, how many people really get away with non-consensually having thousands of women?
There's an evolutionary question for you. Well, reasonable people wouldn't do that. Oh yeah, right. Reasonable people.
Well, if you're going to do something like that, not only would you have to be unreasonable, you would have to be surrounded by unreasonable people who allow it. Peterson seems to think that belief in a god is the only thing that can stop such behavior. However, the places where such behavior is the least common are not the places that are the most religious.
Yeah, right. Reasonable people. Yeah.
Thank you.
So if it's not clear, I can point to the giants. I can't point to the mega giant.
It's because it's an abstraction.
What's the difference between thinking that God is an abstraction and being an atheist? Theists, at least typically, believe that God is an entity, not an abstraction.
Sure, but when you hold Christ up as a particular figure, the only information that I have about Jesus comes from the Bible. And rather than going through all of it again, because there's lots of people with questions, if you go to ironchariots.org, you will find a verse-by-verse deconstruction of the Sermon on the Mount where I point out that Jesus gave some good advice and some crappy advice and some questionable advice, and that's not enough. And there's not a secular humanist organization or country on the planet that has ever produced as a good thing, an intentional good thing, rapists and murderers. So,
Well, that's highly debatable. That's highly debatable.
actually,
one of
it's
the things
absolutely true because there's never been a secular humanist government on the planet.
I don't know. I think the Soviets were pretty secular
No,
humanists.
I'm very curious as to what Peterson thinks secular humanist means. A humanist is someone who prioritizes human well-being. How does intentionally producing brutality do that exactly? Secular humanism, pretty much by definition, would oppose such a thing. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.